Hello everyone, welcome to Behind the Battle channel. Don't forget subscribe to get more videos please. The term Cold War was first used in 1945 by English writer George Orwell. He used it to describe the state of constant political and ideological tension between nations that stopped short of direct, open warfare. More broadly, the phrase came to define the global rivalry between the two superpowers that emerged after World War II, the United States and the Soviet Union. Historians have debated the origins of the Cold War. Some believe it began shortly after the end of World War II, while others argue that its roots can be traced back even earlier, to 1917, when the Bolsheviks overthrew the Russian monarchy and established the world's first communist state, the Soviet Union. This event, known as the October Revolution, marked a turning point in Russia's relationship with the Western powers, which had previously been allies during World War I. Immediately after coming to power, the Soviet government withdrew from the First World War by signing a separate peace treaty with Germany. This move left the Western allies to continue the war alone against Germany, sowing seeds of distrust, particularly from the United States and Britain, who began to view the Bolsheviks not only as ideological enemies but as German collaborators. This distrust deepened when Western leaders discovered that Vladimir Lenin, the leader of the Bolsheviks, had been allowed to return to Russia from exile with assistance from Germany, an act that seemed to confirm their suspicions. The ideological divide between the communist Soviet Union and the democratic, capitalist West became increasingly stark. In 1919, the Soviet Communist Party established the Communist International, or Comintern, with the explicit goal of spreading communism worldwide, directly challenging the capitalist systems of the West. This heightened the ideological battle, making cooperation nearly impossible. Following World War I, the Soviet Union was excluded from the circle of victorious nations. Although it had once been an ally of Britain and France, the Soviet Union was not invited to participate in the Treaty of Versailles negotiations and was denied membership in the League of Nations, largely because of its communist ideology. From that point on, the Soviet leadership began to harbor deep resentment towards the Western powers, feeling they were being treated as pariahs on the world stage. During World War II, the United States and the Soviet Union found themselves once again fighting on the same side, this time against Nazi Germany. However, this alliance was one of necessity, not trust or friendship. Both nations shared a common enemy in Hitler, but their underlying relationship remained tense and suspicious. These tensions were clearly visible during the three major wartime conferences involving the leaders of the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union. The first of these, known as the Tehran Conference, took place at the Soviet Embassy in Tehran, Iran, from the 28th of November to the 1st of December, 1943. There, US President Franklin D. Roosevelt, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, and Soviet leader Joseph Stalin discussed military strategy for defeating Germany. They agreed that the Soviet Union would launch an offensive from the east, while the Western allies would invade from the west. As part of the alliance, the American and British leaders ultimately agreed to Joseph Stalin's demands to take control of Eastern Europe after victory over Hitler. The Western allies also accepted the Soviet annexation of eastern Poland, compensating Poland by giving it a portion of German territory. By February 1945, as the Western allies advanced from the west and Soviet forces had already occupied large parts of Eastern Europe, the three major powers, America, Britain, and the Soviet Union, met for the second time at the Yalta Conference in Crimea. Their main focus was the post-war governance of Germany. At Yalta, they agreed to divide Germany into four occupation zones, one each for the United States, Britain, the Soviet Union, and France. Even Berlin, the capital of Germany and located deep in the Soviet zone, would be split into four parts as well. Later that year, from July to August 1945, the leaders reconvened at the Potsdam Conference near Berlin to finalize the occupation and administration plans. After World War II ended, Europe was effectively split in two, the East under Soviet control and the West under the influence of the United States. Germany, the former enemy, was left in ruins, and cooperation between the Soviet Union and the United States quickly dissolved into rivalry. This rivalry grew into a global power struggle, with both sides vying for influence, not only through military buildup and the nuclear arms race, but also through competition in space and involvement in civil wars around the world. These tensions marked the beginning of what became known as the Cold War. The roots of this conflict can be traced back as far as the 1917 Bolshevik Revolution during World War I. However, the events that truly ignited the Cold War emerged after World War II, beginning around 1945. In that year, U.S. President Franklin D. Roosevelt passed away due to illness. Vice President Harry Truman succeeded him. Although the US and the Soviet Union had worked together to defeat Nazi Germany, their ideologies and ambitions were fundamentally opposed. The United States championed liberal democracy and capitalism, where citizens could own property and enjoy individual freedoms. The Soviet Union, under Stalin, followed a communist model with a centralized, state-controlled economy and strict political control aimed at distributing wealth equally among all citizens. Truman, known for his staunch anti-communist views, was ideologically opposed to Stalin, who despised capitalism in turn. Their conflicting visions for post-war Germany deepened tensions. The US wanted to help Germany rebuild into a strong trading partner, while Stalin preferred a weak Germany that could be easily controlled and serve as a buffer zone. In early 1946, US diplomat George Kennan, stationed in Moscow, sent a lengthy telegram to Washington. In it, he warned that the Soviet Union was driven by a belief that peaceful coexistence with the US was impossible. He advised a long-term strategy to contain Soviet expansion at all costs. This approach became known as the containment policy, which President Truman adopted. By 1947, Truman publicly declared that the United States must help all countries at risk of Soviet oppression, especially poorer nations vulnerable to communist influence. It was at that critical moment when President Harry Truman requested that Congress allocate $400 million in aid to support Turkey and Greece in their struggle against communist insurgencies that were being backed by the Soviet Union. Truman's speech before Congress would later be known as the Truman Doctrine, and the year 1947 is widely regarded by historians as the starting point of the Cold War, a conflict that would stretch across 4 decades. The Cold War officially began in 1947 and came to an end in 1991, following the collapse of the Soviet Union. Over more than 40 years, the Cold War evolved through multiple distinct phases. In the beginning, the confrontation between the United States and the Soviet Union was concentrated in Europe, where the Iron Curtain came down, dividing the continent into 2 spheres, Eastern Europe, under Soviet influence, and Western Europe, aligned with the West. Germany itself was split in 2, East Germany, controlled by communists, and West Germany, allied with the United States and Western democracies. The nuclear arms race soon escalated, beginning in 1949, when the Soviet Union successfully tested its first nuclear weapon, ending America's brief period as the world's sole nuclear superpower. In the years that followed, the Cold War expanded beyond Europe, becoming a global confrontation. The victory of Mao Zedong's communist forces in China and the outbreak of the Korean War from 1950 to 1953 further heightened tensions. After the death of Joseph Stalin in 1953, relations between the US and USSR fluctuated, at times easing, at other times growing dangerously tense. One of the most perilous moments came during the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, when the world stood on the brink of nuclear war. Following that crisis, the Cold War entered a new stage. Despite both being communist powers, the Soviet Union and China split apart, weakening the global communist front. Tensions between the US and USSR temporarily eased during a period known by the French term détente. But in 1979, after both powers intervened in the Afghan Civil War, détente came to an end. The Cold War intensified once again, and some historians refer to this period as the Second Cold War. In 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev became the General Secretary of the Soviet Communist Party. He introduced sweeping political and economic reforms under the banners of glasnost, openness, and perestroika, restructuring. By 1989, the Soviet Union had withdrawn troops from Afghanistan, and Gorbachev declared an end to interference in the domestic affairs of Eastern Bloc countries. He also allowed those countries the freedom to choose their own paths. As a result, anti-communist uprisings erupted across Eastern Europe. Communist governments began collapsing one after another. By the end of 1989, the Berlin Wall, the most visible symbol of the Iron Curtain dividing East and West, was brought down. The fall of the Berlin Wall marked the symbolic end of the Iron Curtain that had split Europe since World War II. Gorbachev's policies didn't just shake the foundations of communism in Eastern Europe, they destabilized the Soviet Union itself. One by one, Soviet republics began declaring independence, starting with the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. Finally, in 1991, the Soviet Union officially dissolved, bringing the Cold War to a formal conclusion. The term Iron Curtain was first used by former British Prime Minister Winston Churchill in a speech delivered in Missouri, USA, on March 5, 1946. He used the term to describe the sharp division of Europe, where the countries behind the curtain were effectively imprisoned under Soviet communist control. The division of Europe after World War II. The division of Europe following World War II was the direct result of collaboration between the Soviet Union and the Western Allies during the final years of the conflict, especially during the Yalta Conference in 1945. When the war first broke out, Stalin had already seized control of several territories, the Baltic states, Lithuania, Estonia, and Latvia, along with parts of Poland, Finland, and Romania. These areas were absorbed into the Soviet Union based on the secret agreements between Stalin and Hitler, made when the two dictators were still allies. However, after Hitler betrayed Stalin by invading the Soviet Union, Stalin shifted alliances and joined the Western Allies. While American and British forces advanced from the west, the Soviet Red Army pushed in from the east. At the end of the war, the countries of Central and Eastern Europe, liberated by Soviet troops, such as Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, Hungary, the former Yugoslavia, and Czechoslovakia, all fell under communist influence. In contrast, the Western European nations, freed by the Western Allies, became closely aligned with the United States, either as allies or liberal capitalist democracies. Only two exceptions, Switzerland and Finland, remain neutral, choosing not to align with either the West or the Soviet bloc. Germany, situated at the heart of Europe, became the center of Cold War tensions. The country was split in two, East Germany under Soviet control and West Germany under the administration of the US, Britain, and France. In 1947, U.S. Secretary of State George C. Marshall launched a massive recovery program, what became known as the Marshall Plan. Its aim was to help rebuild the war-torn economies of European nations. Although the plan was offered to all European countries, including the Soviet Union and those in Eastern Europe, it came with one condition: participating nations had to adopt market-oriented economic reforms. The Soviets refused to join and actively blocked Eastern Bloc nations from accepting American aid. Stalin feared that participation in the Marshall Plan would weaken Soviet influence over those countries. In response, the USSR introduced its own economic initiative for communist countries, the Molotov Plan, named after Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov. This later evolved into the Council for Mutual Economic Assistance, or Comecon. The Marshall and Molotov plans deepened the division between East and West Europe, politically and economically. Not long afterward, the two superpowers began to confront each other militarily as well, forming rival alliances. In 1949, the Western powers established the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, in Washington, D.C. The founding members included 12 countries, the United States and Canada from North America, and 10 Western European nations, Britain, France, Italy, Portugal, Belgium, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Denmark, Norway, and Iceland. NATO was built on the principle of collective defense. Article 5 of the NATO Charter states that an attack against one member is considered an attack against all, requiring all members to respond in defense. The Soviet Union did not immediately form a counter-alliance, but after West Germany joined NATO, Stalin responded by creating the Warsaw Pact in 1955. This military alliance brought together the Eastern Bloc under Soviet leadership, mirroring the structure and goals of NATO. And so, through a series of strategic moves, economic initiatives, and military alliances, Europe was effectively split into two opposing blocs, setting the stage for the Cold War that would dominate global politics for decades. In 1949, the United States, Britain, and France agreed to merge their zones of control in Western Germany and bring an end to their occupation. They allowed the creation of an independent German state called the Federal Republic of Germany. The Western Allies hoped that this new democratic West Germany would eventually reunify with Soviet-controlled East Germany. However, Stalin refused. Instead, he ordered the German Communist Party to establish a separate state in the East, called the German Democratic Republic. From that point on, Germany was officially divided into two separate countries, West Germany, known as the Federal Republic of Germany, and East Germany, known as the German Democratic Republic. On May 5, 1955, West Germany was admitted as a member of NATO. In response, Stalin formed a military alliance of Eastern Bloc nations, known as the Warsaw Pact, on May 14, 1955, with East Germany joining as a member. The division of Germany by the victorious powers of World War II had its roots in the Yalta and Potsdam conferences. In 1945, Germany was split into 4 zones of occupation, one each controlled by the Soviet Union, the United States, Britain, and France. Berlin, the capital, was also divided into 4 sectors despite being deep inside the Soviet-controlled zone. However, no clear agreement had been made on access routes between West Berlin and the Western-controlled zones of Germany. This would soon become a serious issue. Located more than 100 kilometers inside Soviet territory, West Berlin was surrounded and vulnerable. As tensions rose between the United States and the Soviet Union, Berlin became the first major flashpoint of the Cold War. In mid-1948, the US, Britain, and France announced plans to unify their zones and create an independent West German state. In retaliation, the Soviets blocked all road, rail, and canal access to West Berlin, cutting it off from the West. President Harry Truman and his top military advisors agreed that the US must not back down or withdraw from Berlin. At the same time, they were determined to avoid military conflict that could trigger another world war. So, they came up with a different solution, to supply the people of West Berlin by air. Almost immediately, the US and its Western allies launched what would become known as the Berlin Airlift. To avoid a direct confrontation, the Soviets allowed Western planes to fly through their airspace and deliver supplies to the isolated city. At first, the airlift was seen as a temporary measure, with hopes the Soviets would soon lift the blockade. But the crisis dragged on, and the airlift continued for nearly a year. From June 1948 to May 1949, hundreds of American, British, and French aircraft flew thousands of missions, delivering up to 5,000 to 6,000 tons of food, fuel, and medicine every single day. By the end of the operation, nearly 300,000 flights had been made, transporting close to 2 million tons of essential supplies. Inside West Berlin, food, medicine, and fuel were strictly rationed, and life was extremely difficult, especially during the harsh winter. But despite the hardships, the people of West Berlin stood firm and fully supported the efforts of the Western Allies. During the Berlin crisis, a common phrase that circulated widely was, "Berlin is cold, but not colder than Siberia." By May 1949, the Soviet Union began to realize that the land blockade would not choke off West Berlin, nor would it provoke the city's residents to revolt against the Western powers. Likewise, the blockade had failed to stop the formation of a Western-aligned German state. Recognizing the failure of their strategy, the Soviets decided to lift the blockade and reopen access routes to West Berlin, effectively ending the Berlin crisis without any direct military confrontation. However, this event marked a critical turning point in the intensifying Cold War. From this moment onward, the two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, viewed each other with deep hostility and distrust. On the 23rd of May, 1949, the Federal Republic of Germany, West Germany, was officially established. But due to Berlin's location deep inside Soviet-controlled East Germany, the Western Allies chose not to designate West Berlin as the capital. Instead, the capital of West Germany was set in Bonn. In response, the Soviet Union created its own state on the 7th of October, 1949, calling it the German Democratic Republic, commonly known as East Germany, with East Berlin as its capital. From 1952 onwards, the East German Communist government sealed all borders with the West in an effort to prevent its citizens from fleeing to West Germany. In Berlin, a physical division took form in 1961, a concrete wall was erected, physically separating East Berlin from West Berlin, which remained under Western Allied control. The Berlin Wall became a powerful symbol of the Cold War, representing the divide between the capitalist West and the communist East. Germany's division mirrored that of other nations like Korea, Yemen, and Vietnam, which were also split into opposing blocs. Eventually, most of these divided nations were reunified, except for Korea, which remains divided to this day. Although the Cold War began in Europe, it soon expanded into Asia. This expansion coincided with the rise of the Chinese Communist Party in 1949 and the outbreak of the Korean War in 1950, which lasted until 1953. Following the Korean War, major changes occurred in leadership. In the United States, Dwight D. Eisenhower, a renowned general from World War II, was elected president in January 1953, succeeding Harry Truman. Meanwhile, in the Soviet Union, Nikita Khrushchev rose to power as head of the Communist Party after the death of Joseph Stalin in March 1953. Upon taking power, Khrushchev moved quickly to strengthen the Eastern Bloc. In 1955, he established the Warsaw Pact, a military alliance meant to counter NATO's growing influence. At the same time, however, Khrushchev also demonstrated a willingness to cooperate with the West. He withdrew Soviet troops from Austria and established diplomatic relations with West Germany. In 1955, during a summit in Geneva with the United States, Britain, and France, Khrushchev expressed his desire for peaceful coexistence between the communist and capitalist blocs, a vision he reiterated at the 1956 Congress of the Soviet Communist Party. There, he openly criticized Stalin's brutal and dictatorial leadership. These moves led many to believe that Khrushchev was preparing to implement significant reforms within the Soviet system. After the death of Stalin, there was hope that the Soviet Union might steer away from his authoritarian ideology and aggressive policies. This raised the possibility that tensions between the Soviet Union and the West might ease. However, such hopes quickly faded with the eruption of the Suez Canal crisis in Egypt. The Suez Canal is a vital waterway connecting the Mediterranean Sea to the Red Sea, forming one of the most important maritime trade routes in the world. It was originally built in 1864 by a French private company under a concession granted by the Egyptian government. In 1954, both the United States and the United Kingdom saw Egypt as a strategically important country in the effort to counter Soviet influence in the Middle East. They offered generous financial assistance to Egypt for key infrastructure projects, including the construction of the Aswan High Dam. Egypt's leader, however, sought to maintain a non-aligned stance and balanced relationships with both the US and the Soviet Union. As part of this strategy, Egypt agreed to purchase weapons from the Soviet Union and even discussed the possibility of securing billions of dollars in Soviet aid. Perceiving this as a betrayal, the US and the UK suspected Egypt of playing both sides and decided to withdraw their financial support. In retaliation, Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal, seizing control from the private company and turning it into a state asset. In October 1956, France and the United Kingdom, in coordination with Israel, launched a military assault on Egypt with the goal of retaking the canal, an essential route for transporting oil from the Middle East to Europe. By November, French, British, and Israeli forces had occupied areas surrounding the canal. In response, Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev issued a stark warning, threatening nuclear retaliation if the invading forces did not withdraw from Egyptian territory. Faced with the threat of nuclear escalation, the United States, rather than assisting its traditional allies, applied further pressure on France, Britain, and Israel. President Eisenhower warned that failure to withdraw would result in severe economic sanctions. The US had not been informed in advance of the military plans and viewed the attack as reckless. Under mounting pressure from both the Soviet Union and the United States, all three invading nations eventually pulled their troops out of Egypt. The Suez Crisis was thus brought to an end. This crisis marked the beginning of Cold War competition in the Middle East. In 1957, the United States adopted a new policy under the Eisenhower Doctrine, pledging military and financial aid to Arab countries resisting communist influence. For France, the Suez Crisis also became a turning point in foreign policy. Bitter over the lack of US support, French leaders concluded that they could no longer rely on America for national security. Under General Charles de Gaulle, France launched its own nuclear weapons program and began working closely with West Germany to promote European integration. This led to the signing of the Treaty of Rome in March 1957, which created the European Economic Community. The founding members were France, West Germany, Italy, Belgium, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands. Finally, in 1960, France successfully tested its first nuclear weapon, becoming the fourth nuclear power in the world, after the United States, the Soviet Union, and the United Kingdom. On August 9, 1945, when the United States dropped the first atomic bomb on the Japanese city of Hiroshima, the world witnessed for the first time the catastrophic power of nuclear weapons. That event marked the beginning of a new era, an age defined by nuclear rivalry and the looming threat of atomic warfare. In the immediate aftermath of World War II, the United States stood alone as the only nation in possession of nuclear weapons. However, this position of ultimate power was short-lived. In 1949, the Soviet Union successfully developed and tested its own nuclear bomb, officially launching the nuclear arms race. From that point on, both the United States and the Soviet Union competed not only in the number of warheads but also in their sophistication. They focused on developing smaller, more powerful nuclear bombs and advanced delivery systems such as intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs, long-range bombers, and submarine-launched missiles. By 1952, the list of nuclear powers grew to 3 when the United Kingdom successfully tested its own atomic weapon. In fact, Britain had been involved in nuclear research since World War II, having collaborated with the United States in the top-secret Manhattan Project. This cooperation, combined with the expertise of German scientists who had fled Nazi persecution, enabled Britain to eventually develop its own arsenal. France became the 4th nuclear power. Unlike Britain, however, France pursued its nuclear weapons program independently, without technical aid or cooperation from the United States. France's success stemmed from its own pool of talented scientists, some of whom were pioneers in nuclear physics. Despite facing financial challenges and a lack of political will at first, France pushed forward. Initially, in the early 1950s, France's nuclear program aimed solely to produce electricity. But everything changed after the 1956 Suez Crisis, when France, Britain, and Israel clashed with Egypt and found themselves opposed by both the Soviet Union and the United States. Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev threatened nuclear retaliation if the tripartite alliance did not withdraw. Surprisingly, the United States not only refused to support its allies but also pressured them economically, warning of sanctions if they continued the invasion. This crisis became a turning point for France. President Charles de Gaulle, returning to power in 1958, decided that France must build its own nuclear weapons to safeguard national security and assert its independence as a global power. 2 years later, in 1960, France successfully tested its first nuclear bomb. Meanwhile, in Asia, China under communist leader Mao Zedong began developing nuclear weapons in the mid-1950s. This decision was driven by repeated confrontations with the United States, first during the Korean War, 1950 to 1953, and later in the Taiwan Strait crisis of the mid-1950s. On multiple occasions, China was forced to back down under the threat of American nuclear force. Although China and the Soviet Union were allies, Mao Zedong did not want to rely entirely on Moscow. Thus, he resolved that China must possess its own nuclear deterrent. China's military nuclear program and the global nuclear arms race. China's military nuclear program officially began operations in 1955, with significant technical support from the Soviet Union. By 1964, China successfully produced and tested its first nuclear weapon. At that point, the number of nuclear-armed nations had grown to 5, the United States, the Soviet Union, the United Kingdom, France, and China. Simultaneously, anti-nuclear movements began to gain momentum across the world. Just 4 years after China's successful nuclear test, in 1968, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, NPT, was signed and entered into force in 1970. The treaty formally recognized the 5 existing nuclear-armed countries as official nuclear powers and allowed them to continue developing nuclear weapons. However, it strictly prohibited them from transferring nuclear weapons technology to other nations, except for peaceful civilian nuclear energy purposes. Meanwhile, non-nuclear nations were permitted to develop nuclear programs, but only for peaceful purposes. The core aim of the NPT was to prevent the spread of nuclear weapons to additional countries beyond the original 5. However, this goal was only partially achieved. Nations like India, Pakistan, and Israel refused to sign the treaty and went on to develop nuclear weapons independently. North Korea, which initially signed the treaty, later withdrew in 2003 and began conducting a series of nuclear tests from 2006 onwards. During the Cold War, both the Soviet Union and the United States sought to demonstrate their global dominance, entering a fierce competition across political, economic, military, and even space domains. After the Soviet Union successfully developed its own nuclear weapons in 1949, America's monopoly on nuclear power ended, sparking an intense arms race, particularly in intercontinental ballistic missile (ICBM) technology capable of reaching the opponent's territory. This rapid advancement in missile technology also paved the way for a new frontier, the space race. Beginning in 1955, leaders from both the US and USSR announced plans to use ICBM technology to launch satellites into space within the next few years. In this early phase of competition, the Soviet Union achieved a major breakthrough. On October 4, 1957, it successfully launched the world's first artificial satellite, Sputnik, into Earth's orbit. This historic milestone shocked American leaders, triggering fear and concern about falling behind in missile and space technology. In response, U.S. President Dwight D. Eisenhower ordered his space program to accelerate its satellite launch schedule. However, the first American attempt, on December 6, 1957, ended in failure when the rocket exploded just minutes after takeoff from Florida. It wasn't until January 31, 1958, 4 months after the Soviet triumph, that the United States finally succeeded in launching its first satellite into orbit. A few months later, President Eisenhower established the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, better known as NASA, marking the official beginning of America's space program. From 1955, the space race between the United States and the Soviet Union escalated. However, the Soviet Union continued to stay one step ahead, achieving success in launching an unmanned spacecraft to land on the Moon. In September 1954, nearly 2 years later, in April 1961, the Soviet cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin became the first human to travel into space, completing an orbit around Earth. About a month after the Soviet Union's achievement, President John F. Kennedy publicly announced that the United States must land a man on the Moon before the end of the decade. The Apollo 11 mission was subsequently planned and launched in 1962. Meanwhile, the U.S. Space Agency's budget was significantly increased by Congress, which helped America's space program gain momentum and eventually surpass the Soviet Union in achievements. By December 1968, the United States successfully sent 3 astronauts to orbit the Moon, although they did not land. On July 16, 1969, at 9:32 a.m. from Florida, the Apollo 11 spacecraft launched with 3 astronauts, aiming to land on the Moon. After traveling 240,000 miles through space, Apollo 11 entered lunar orbit on July 19, 1969, and the following day, astronauts Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin descended to the Moon's surface, leaving Michael Collins behind in lunar orbit. Armstrong became the first human to set foot on the Moon on July 20, 1969. The success of Apollo 11 was a monumental achievement for the United States, fulfilling President Kennedy's promise to land a man on the Moon before the decade's end. This victory marked a significant milestone in the space race, cementing America's place as the leader in the Cold War space competition. From 1969 to 1972, the U.S. sent 12 astronauts to the Moon during 5 successful Apollo missions. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union attempted 4 moon landing missions but failed each time and eventually abandoned the program in 1974. In 1979, as Soviet troops entered Afghanistan, tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union escalated again, particularly in the military and diplomatic arenas. This period of confrontation intensified when Ronald Reagan became president in the early 1980s. The U.S. began covert operations and opened support for anti-communist movements worldwide, leading to a significant arms race. By the early 1980s, the Soviet Union had built up the largest military force, surpassing the US in terms of weaponry, but the costs of military spending strained the Soviet economy. By the late 1980s, Soviet military expenditures accounted for up to 25% of its GDP. Ultimately, these extensive expenses in the Cold War, especially on arms races, space competition, and military interventions, combined with the inefficiency of the communist economic system, severely impacted the Soviet economy. The declining global oil prices in the 1980s also aggravated their economic problems, leading to the collapse of the Soviet Union. This passage discusses the economic struggles of the Soviet Union, which was heavily reliant on oil exports. In this context, Mikhail Gorbachev rose to power in 1985 as the leader of the Soviet Union. At the time, he was 54 years old, and many viewed him as a new generation leader, distinct from his predecessors. Gorbachev focused on economic reforms and aimed to address the country's economic issues, prioritizing improvements to civil infrastructure and the general living standards of the people. He introduced significant reforms, such as perestroika, which eased the centrally planned economic system and allowed some elements of a market economy, such as private enterprises and state-owned enterprises gaining more control over production. Gorbachev also opened the door for foreign investments, which had never been allowed under previous communist policies. However, these reforms met resistance, particularly from conservative factions within the Communist Party itself. Gorbachev realized that to maintain support for his reforms, he needed to gain the backing of the people. This led him to expand freedoms of speech and access to information, as well as political reforms to ensure greater participation in the political system. In 1987, he started further political reforms, including the introduction of limited political freedoms, such as freedom of speech and a more open media. Political prisoners were released, and there was a shift in how government institutions were structured, allowing non-party members to hold positions. In 1989, the first free elections in the Soviet Union were held, marking a major political milestone. In terms of foreign policy, Gorbachev sought to reduce tensions with the United States. He aimed to limit the arms race, which was a massive economic burden on the Soviet Union. This period saw a series of summit meetings between Gorbachev and US President Ronald Reagan, culminating in the signing of key arms reduction agreements, such as the INF Treaty in 1987, which led to significant reductions in nuclear weapons. However, Gorbachev's political reforms caused unrest in communist countries within the Soviet bloc and even within the Soviet Union itself, which eventually contributed to the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. The Cold War, which was marked by intense military rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union, did not lead to direct conflict but resulted in numerous proxy wars across the globe. The end of the Cold War in 1991 was a major turning point that helped resolve many long-standing civil wars around the world, including Cambodia's protracted internal conflict. Although peace negotiations in Cambodia had already begun as early as 1985, progress was hampered by the involvement of powerful foreign backers on both sides. China and the United States supported the Khmer Rouge, while the People's Republic of Kampuchea was backed by Vietnam and the Soviet Union. In particular, Vietnam sent massive numbers of troops and experts to maintain its influence in Cambodia. By the late 1980s, under the leadership of Mikhail Gorbachev, the Soviet Union began reducing military involvement and foreign aid, including its support for Vietnam. As a result, Vietnam was forced to withdraw its troops from Cambodia in 1989. At the same time, China and the United States also withdrew their support for the Khmer Rouge. From that point on, Cambodia's peace talks gained new momentum, ultimately leading to the signing of the Paris Peace Agreements on October 23, 1991. However, the end of the Cold War did not always result in peace. In some cases, conflicts born out of the Cold War continued, or even escalated. A key example is the Korean Peninsula, where tensions between North and South Korea persist to this day. During the Cold War, global politics was shaped by two rival superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. After the Soviet Union collapsed, the United States emerged as the sole global superpower, dominating not only military and economic spheres, but also diplomacy and culture. American culture spread across the globe, largely thanks to the rapid development of communication technologies and a key global trend known as globalization. During the Cold War, both superpowers invested heavily in technological advancement, particularly in military and space sectors, in order to outpace each other. When the Cold War ended, much of this technology was redirected into civilian use. This marked the beginning of a major global transformation that historians now refer to as the technological revolution, or, in more recent terms, the digital revolution. Among the most transformative technologies to emerge after the Cold War were computers, mobile phones, and most significantly, the Internet. Originally developed in the United States during the Cold War as a military communication tool, the Internet was tightly restricted to prevent it from falling into enemy hands. But once the Cold War ended, the US government allowed its civilian use. From then on, the Internet expanded rapidly and became one of the most revolutionary means of communication in human history. This explosion in computer and Internet technologies made communication faster and more accessible than ever before. Distance was no longer a barrier, and national borders became less of an obstacle. These developments greatly accelerated trade, cultural exchange, the spread of knowledge, and most importantly, the flow of information. As a result, a new global awareness began to take shape. More people started thinking beyond their own countries and began caring about shared global issues, particularly the urgent need to protect the environment. This growing sense of collective responsibility is one of the defining features of our post-Cold War world. The fight against global warming remains a highly prominent issue, continuing to draw widespread attention up to the present day. Thank you for watching. Good luck.